We've got some preliminaries out of the way. We have identified the size of the challenge that we face, or at least we've acknowledged that it's a huge challenge. So how do you go interested in these things? Few routes really available to us. A lot of what we know about the nervous system is informed by pathology. That is, by stuff that happens when things seem to go wrong. This includes medical conditions, trauma, um, damage done to the nervous system produces specific effects, and from that we try to reverse engineer a view of what the intact system was. We'll see that there are problems with this, but that's where we've got a lot of our information. Unsurprisingly, nobody seems to be in favor of just opening up humans and poking things into their brain. We don't do that lightly. We do that somewhat more easily with animals. And so an awful lot of what we've learned has been from animals, both from direct study of their nervous system and from behavioral experiments and so on. And remember, brains evolve very slowly. Human brains are almost identical to ape brains. There are some basic principles underlying nervous systems that remain common from the simplest of animals with nervous systems to the most complex. So we can learn a lot from animals. But of course, questions pertaining to that which makes humans different from animals are very difficult to address with animal experiments. So a neural basis for language or reason, for example, which have historically been singled out as particularly human characteristics, these are difficult to study in animals, as you might imagine. An awful lot of recent work in neuroscience has been fueled by technological developments which have greatly increased our capacity to form images of various kinds. That means make recordings, video recordings, electrical recordings, make images, pictures of the brain under various conditions. We will visit some of these technologies and see what they show and don't show. And throughout most of what we've learned, what we conjectured about the brain has been based on hypotheticals and inference drawn from indirect sources, such as, for example, behavioral studies or philosophy or theoretical considerations of what must be in place in order to generate phenomena that we see. So these are very different routes towards knowledge, and ideally, when you have a complex problem on your hands, you should have a diverse bunch of ways to address that, to think about it, and to triangulate results, because results will be much more satisfying if different independent sources of scientific work point in the same direction. We're first going to start out with something which is not science. Clearly not science. It is discredited. It once upon a time was sort of science. And we're talking about phrenology here, which at the end of the 18th century and beginning of the 19th century was one approach taken to understanding the brains. And this starts off with the attribution of function to diverse parts of the brain. In fact, so important was the distinction of functions that proponents of phrenology decided that the brain was actually not one organ, but many organs. And now it depends what you consider a person is and how many functions the brain or sub-brain organs need to carry. Nobody could ever agree on the number of functions. They were made up. Franz Joseph Gall, a Swiss anatomist, believed the brain consisted of 27 distinct organs, there's 27 distinct functions. Others had up to 40. There was no agreement here. And by about 1830, 1840, phrenology had died a death. It was not a productive scientific inquiry. So Gall started with some assumptions. He started assuming that the brain is the organ of the mind. Given that we don't know what the mind is either, this is it's a starting point. He noted correctly that the brain is not homogeneous, it's not a sphere, it's got parts, and he suggested that it was consisted of different organs with different functions. The organs were regionally local, so you could identify them in space and you could separate one from the other. And Gall's view of things was such that if you had a bigger one, that was better. The relative size of any particular mental organ was indicative of the power or strength of that organ. Now, we're going to have to ask carefully, what do you mean by an organ, and what are the functions that you're using to carve up the brain here? Well, we'll look at that in just a second. It is a fact that babies are born with incomplete skulls. And the skull only ossifies over the first year or two. So that skull shape gradually sort of forms over the developing brain, and this was abused, one might say, by phrenologists to infer that one could detect the size of the mental organs underlying beneath the skull by feeling up bumps on the skull. Now, if this kind of speculation is allowed to run wild, as it did, then it gets folded into social and political arguments, as our brain science necessarily will always today too. And in this particular case, it meant that you had a ridiculous industry in which the quality of someone's character is judged by someone else, and even their intelligence, their trustworthiness, and so on, were evaluated by feeling bumps on the skull. Total Magic Man stuff. It was totally discredited by about 1840. It remains as an important warning about the dangers of the premature association of place and function. Now, as I said, nobody could ever agree what the functions are. And these functions were drawn from older speculation about the idea that we have distinct psychological faculties, like the faculty for remembering or a faculty for language. And once you posit a function like this, then you can always attribute it to a place in the brain. Some of the other functions that were suggested were the carnivorous instinct, poetical talent. There's no limit to what kind of function you can dream up. As we've seen, function needs to be taken seriously. We mention phrenology not because it's current science, but because the dangers of this pseudoscience recur today. And the vast outgrowth in our ability to image parts of the brain has sort of encouraged people to imaginatively dream up functions and associate them with places in the brain, because images show places. Some images show places. We'll see other kinds. And so, particularly the branch of imaging known as functional magnetic resonance imaging has given rise to a kind of work which is often criticized for its phrenological similarity. So here's a table, for example, showing some of these supposed functions that the phrenologists use, like the function of circumspection, the faculty of language, the aptness to receive an education, the valor and self-defense. And there's a translation then into the kind of terms that can be used in contemporary experimental work. So, for example, let's take circumspection. Slightly odd to suggest that you have a brain organ that is responsible for circumspection, but around 1800, circumspection is simply seen as a virtue, so maybe it has a brain bit. Translated to modern terminology, we might correlate that with activation, brain activation, correlated with harm avoidance. And indeed, we can find fMRI studies that do this, and that pick out a part of the brain, in this case the nucleus accumbens, and associate it with that particular virtue. And you can look through this list yourself. It's quite insightful. In fact, that's one page of the list. There's a few more. The reason I started this section on cognitive neuroscience with a discussion of the word function is I think you can see how this haunts the whole of everything we do as we come to interpret brains. If we suggest that a person has a poetic talent, then it's very easy to find a bit of this confusing lump of meat and say that's where the poetic talent sits. That sounds ridiculous. But supposing we come up with an experiment in which we put people into scanners and we ask them to generate creative stories or not creative stories. So tell me a fanciful story involving dragons and you last summer, or tell me how you brushed your teeth this morning. If we do that kind of comparison and we do some brain imaging, there'll probably be some part of the brain that is more active in one condition than another, or that shows up. Part of the brain will show up. And we'll have repeated the phrenological mistake. So imaging is a mixed blessing, and the centrality of the notion of function will not go away as we pursue our inquiry here into cognitive neuroscience.